Okay, so what's going on in this passage? Make a few points here. Number one, remember that the context of these words we've just heard from Jesus are his instructions to his 12 apostles or his 12 disciples. Although we tend to use the word disciple in a really broad sense to mean anyone who's a believer, in a first century Greek context, in Jesus' setting, in the Gospels, the word disciple, mathetes, literally means a student or a learner. So in this context, Jesus is describing his intimate circle of the 12 disciples, the 12 students that he's chosen from among all his followers to be entrusted with his own authority and to go out and to imitate him by preaching the good news of the kingdom of God. So when he talks about disciple, that's the primary meaning in its context here, the mission of the 12 disciples. Now in that context, he's talking to the disciples about their own discipleship, about the demands of following him. And he begins with this really shocking statement that whoever loves his father or mother more than me isn't worthy of me. In other words, isn't worthy to be my disciple. Now, it's hard for me to stress just how radical that would have been in a first century Jewish setting, in particular because of the Decalogue, of the 10 Commandments. So if you go back to Exodus chapter 20 and to the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments that God gave to the people of Israel at Mount Sinai, one of the things you're going to notice is that the first 3 commandments are about God and about honoring him, not blaspheming and whatnot. But the second set of commandments, the last 7, are all about love of neighbor and your relationship with others. The very first one of those second set of commandments is honor thy father and thy mother. Okay? It's the 4th commandment. And in Hebrew, the word there for honor, kavod, literally means to glorify or give glory to your mother and your father. So the idea of honoring one's father and mother was like the fundamental commandment in your relationship with other human beings. The first obligation you had as a person was to give glory and honor to the people who gave life to you, namely your mother and your father. So for Jesus, a rabbi, a teacher, a prophet, to come to his disciples and say, if you love your father and your mother more than me, you're not worthy to be my disciple, would have been an absolutely shocking claim. Because what Jesus is essentially doing is kind of turning the tables on common, not just social customs, but on the Decalogue itself, which would put your relationship with your family, and in particular with your parents, as being of the highest importance. And Jesus is saying here, no. Your relationship with me, your love for me, exceeds that of your love for your parents. It's more central. It's more important. And if you love them more than you love me, you can't be my student. You can't be my disciple. So again, just translate that for a second into like a contemporary setting. Imagine if you walked into a college classroom and the professor came out on the first day of class and said, okay, before we begin, I need to let you know something. If you don't love me more than you love your parents, you can't be a student in my class. Everyone would be shocked because obviously that professor would be demanding an extremely radical and unheard of level of commitment from his students to him. And not just commitment, but of love. That's really what Jesus is saying here. So that's the first point here. Jesus is bringing the discipleship discourse to an end with a shocking demand. But he doesn't leave it there. He goes even more. He also says that whoever loves sons or daughters more than me isn't worthy of me. And I think it's understandable. I mean, even apart from a knowledge of the Decalogue, it's natural for mothers and fathers to put their children at the very center of their lives, to love their children above all others. And yet Jesus is saying you can't love your children more than you love me. Right? Again, what prophet would ask such a thing? What teacher would ask such a thing? Well, the Jews would have known that if you go back to the Old Testament, the only person who ever demands not just that kind of allegiance, but that kind of love is the Lord himself. And they would have known it because every day, several times a day, they would have prayed the great prayer in Deuteronomy 6, known as the Shema. Hear, O Israel. Deuteronomy 6, verse 4-6 reads as follows. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Deuteronomy 6, 4-6. So this was what elsewhere in the Gospels Jesus calls the greatest commandment. The commandment to love God with all one's heart, all one's soul, all one's strength, above all others. And yet now Jesus is saying, I want you, to the disciples, to love me with that kind of radical and supreme love. So what's going on here? Well, this is one of those times in the Gospels where Jesus doesn't explicitly declare, I am God, but he does implicitly reveal that he is divine, because he's making a claim on the love of the disciples that only God himself could make. He wants them to love him radically, completely, totally, even to the exclusion, or not to the exclusion necessarily, we'll look at that in a minute, but above the love of parents and above the love of children. Okay? So, and if you don't do that, he's basically saying, you're not worthy to be my disciple, which only makes sense if following Jesus means following God, because it would be following that great commandment from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 6. So he's demanding divine love, the kind of love that God alone can demand on the part of his disciples.